afternoon, live from Toronto on the GBKM network. This is the Chat Up Show, the show where we catch you up with a chat up of our weekly headlines. I'm your host, Elizabeth Floyd, and I hope that you are ready to chat it up with me today. Now, as always, you know you can keep up with the GBKM network in various ways. You can continue to listen and watch live 24/7 at www.gbkm.tv or www.gbkm.fm, where you can catch up on any past shows you may have missed. Don't worry, they're there in our past shows tab. You can also check out upcoming shows so you don't miss a future show. You can learn more about our on-air personalities with our OAP tab. And you can check out our breaking news to learn about global breaking news that's happening around the world. And you can continue to watch us on Facebook at GBKM Television and YouTube at GBKM TV, where you can like, share, comment, and subscribe. You can also download our free app. Yes, it is free and available to download on the App Store and the Google Play Store. The GBKM app offers you the same features as our website, but you also get notified every time we go live. So you will get to make sure you turn on your notifications so that you receive a notification every time we go live with one of our shows on the network. And you probably never miss a show again, but not to worry. We still have the past shows, the upcoming shows, and all of that good stuff available right on our app. You can also follow us on Instagram at GBKMFM and Twitter at GBKM_FM. Now, just a quick little update as to what's going on for us on this side of the globe in Ontario. It's going to be May, but it snowed this morning, and it's a little bit of a shocker for a lot of us because summer is right around the corner, but then again, it is Ontario, so are we really all that surprised? But it was kind of a change of things, waking up and seeing a ground full of snow in late April. But that is just the way the cookie crumbles these days. And since we are still under lockdown, I know Ontarians, a lot of us are getting a little frustrated and getting tired of the lockdown, but we are still under lockdown because cases continue to rise in the province and especially here in Toronto. But vaccine rollout has continued, and it has recently been announced that the AstraZeneca vaccine has been approved for use for those aged 40 and over. So now you are able to schedule in your appointment for age 40 and over, and the province is continuing to do pop-up vaccine clinics and rollouts for different postal codes. You can check out your postal code online to find out when or if they've already started vaccination in your area. I got mine a few weeks ago, so that was good. But yeah, so that's a little quick update regarding vaccinations in the province. You can now receive the AstraZeneca vaccine. It's been approved, and those aged 40 and over are now able to make their appointments to book their vaccine, or just look out for some pop-up clinics that are often reported based on postal codes as well. Now, yesterday was a monumental day as a verdict was reached in the case of the state versus Derek Chauvin, who was the former police officer that held his knee on George Floyd's neck for more than 9 minutes last summer in May of 2020. Now, the trial lasted 3 weeks. It did bring back a lot of emotions for a lot of people having watched the video of Chauvin's knee on Floyd's neck for that length of time, being traumatized by that alone already, reliving and rehearing the accounts from witnesses and other first responders on the scene, brought back a lot of emotions for a lot of people. But I would say that this verdict was a glimmer of hope in such a sad situation. I mean, at the end of the day, Derek Chauvin has been convicted of murder. He's been found guilty on all charges. And that's a verdict that a lot of people have been waiting for since last year, since this incident sparked protests across the globe. I mean, we had protests popping up everywhere in Nigeria, in parts of Europe, across North America, across the United States, across all states in the United States. So it just showed how impactful this event was. And a lot of us wouldn't have known about it if it weren't for the footage that was circulating on social media. I mean, we all got to get a first account of what had happened to George Floyd in the last few minutes of his life, and how we ended up where we were, how we ended up seeing so many protests erupting, so many calls for action, calls for change. And this seemed to be a breaking point and had us really thinking about how many more videos of people being killed, essentially, and those doing the killing wouldn't receive the necessary, they won't be held accountable for their actions in the case of justice being served. We've seen it a lot happen over the years. You know, these officers are either just fired and receive paid leave or paid suspension. But to see, it is a high-profile case now, to be honest, to see the case go to this level and actually reach a verdict, it was a moment of relief for a lot of us. We were kind of holding our breath, right? But it's also brought up conversations about how sharing traumatic content is necessary in the fight for change. How much we need to see this to really believe what's going on, and that this is a reality, and that this is happening, and it needs to receive some awareness. It needs to receive some recognition as well, and that there needs to be conversations around what we're witnessing and what's happening to people. It's not new for us to wake up and see a video of someone being killed by the cops or witnessing police brutality on social media or even in the news cycles. This isn't something new, unfortunately. But there was something that was so pivotal about this particular moment, this particular case. It wasn't the first time we witnessed, you know, a black body being traumatized, brutalized, and even murdered on camera that year. In 2020, it wasn't the first time. We remember the case of Ahmaud Arbery from February that we didn't really see unwind until about a month before George Floyd's death. Also, Breonna Taylor's story and what happened to her. These aren't new things, but there was this shift, a shift that happened when folks were calling for justice for George Floyd. And it seemed now that it was vindicated. We've seen what the verdict came out to be. Derek Chauvin has been found guilty. And we actually do have a clip of yesterday's verdict and delivery. So we're gonna show that right now.
Members of the jury, I will now read the verdicts as they will appear in the permanent records of the 4th Judicial District. State of Minnesota, County of Hennepin, District Court, 4th Judicial District. State of Minnesota Plaintiff versus Derek Michael Chauvin, Defendant. Verdict, Count 1. Court File Number 27, CR 20-12646. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to Count 1, unintentional second-degree murder while committing a felony, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April 2021 at 1:44 p.m. Signed, Juror Foreperson, Juror Number 19. Same caption, verdict Count 2. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to Count 2, third-degree murder, perpetrating an eminently dangerous act, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April 2021 at 1:45 p.m. Signed by Jury Foreperson, Juror Number 19. Same caption, verdict Count 3. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to Count 3, second-degree manslaughter, culpable negligence, creating an unreasonable risk, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April 2021 at 1:45 p.m. Jury Foreperson 019. Members of the jury, I'm now going to ask you individually if these are your true and correct verdicts. Please respond yes or no. Juror Number 2, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror Number 9, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror Number 19, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror Number 27, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror Number 44, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror Number 52, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror Number 55, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror Number 79, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror Number 85, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror Number 89, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror Number 91, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror Number 92, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Are these your verdicts? So say you one, so say you all.
Yes.
Yes.
Members of the jury, I find that the verdicts as read reflect the will of the jury and will be filed accordingly. I have to thank you on behalf of the people of the state of Minnesota for not only jury service, but heavy-duty jury service. What I'm going to ask you to do now is to follow the deputy back into your usual room, and I will join you in a few minutes to answer questions and to advise you further. So, all rise for the jury. All right, be seated. With the guilty verdicts returned, we're going to have Blakely, you may file a written argument as to Blakely factors within 1 week. The court will issue findings on the Blakely factors, the factual findings, 1 week after that. We'll order a PSI immediately, returnable in 4 weeks. And we will also have a briefing on, after you get the PSI, 6 weeks from now, and then 8 weeks from now, we will have sentencing. We'll get you the exact dates in a scheduling order. Is there a motion on behalf of the state?
Your Honor, the state would move to have the court revoke the defendant's bail and remand him into custody pending sentencing.
Bail is revoked, bond is discharged, and the defendant is remanded to the custody of the Hennepin County Sheriff. Anything further?
All
All right. Thank you.
Wow. And that was the verdict of the state versus, of the case of the state versus Derek Chauvin that concluded essentially last night. Now, on May 25th, the world was rocked by the video of Derek Chauvin murdering George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and it sparked outrage and protest across the globe. The video itself was shared across all platforms in news cycles, and it was so triggering to some that they couldn't even watch it in its entirety. To see his neck being pinned down for that long, that period of time, it was a moment, you know, where a lot of folks this is a reality for a lot of us living in this world, that they could empathize with what was going on, not just for George Floyd, who, you know, he couldn't breathe, was calling out for help, but also the bystanders as well who were witnessing it. And even the 17-year-old girl who had the courage to videotape this incident and post this online as well. So traumatic for so many people, but even just watching that video was traumatic and triggering enough that a lot of people stayed away from watching this trial unfold until last night's verdict, that it was too much to relive watching that happen. And can't even imagine what his family had been going through this past year, waiting for this day to come, waiting for some kind of justice for George Floyd. And now hearing this verdict, and even the people were happy that even bail is being revoked as well in this situation, was a moment of relief for a lot of us. But it also brings back some time to, you know, reflect on the fact that this was such a triggering moment. This video, it was a lot to take in. And it's not the first time we have witnessed someone, you know, being killed on camera, of course, but it was just how much this spread, how quickly it spread, how many people were picking up on the story, how many people empathized with George Floyd in this situation, how many people felt such strong emotions towards it, not just Black people across all races as well, that this was a moment that it was eye-opening, that we were able to wake up and realize, like, hey, this is a reality, that this isn't just something you hear on the news that you can just turn off for the day when it gets too much. It's not just a movie that's been directed and set up and has a script. This is real life, and this is a reality that we have to deal with. And it was the fact that there was the video evidence that a lot of people could see it in their face, like, okay, this is real, this is bad. This isn't something that should be happening. This isn't something that should be normalized, but it feels as though it has been for some time, you know, getting to this point. As I mentioned before, this was a high profile case because of that video, because of how many people had seen it. How many world leaders have even spoken out against the actions committed by all officers in this in the video, in this case. How many people even just spoke out, were able to come up and say, hey, enough is enough, we're not going to take this anymore. That video was revolutionary. We don't even have to show it. I'm sure it's already popping up in your mind. Clips of it is popping. It's hard not to see it, you know? It's hard not to think about it. It's hard to forget George Floyd's face, forget his cries for help. And we won't ever have to, because there's that video out there for forever, essentially, that will continue to remind us that this needs reform, that something needs to change. And it was a moment of hope for a lot of people. Like, this maybe is the wake call the world needs to finally realize that anti-Black racism did not end after, you know, integration and segregation and the Jim Crow era ended. It didn't end after the civil rights movements. It didn't end after Martin Luther King or Malcolm X. It didn't end, it's continuing. We're seeing it in police interactions with Black people constantly. We see these videos so much. And it has us thinking, just how much do we need to see for us to realize that this is a problem? Because it's not just what's being spread on social media of the realities of this situation, it's also in the movies and the films and TV shows. Of course, this moment sparked a need to have the conversations that were necessary, but the trauma spilled over into art as well. I mean, we know that life imitates art and all of that, and a lot of people draw inspiration from the realities of their lives. But when we're starting to see almost an acknowledgement on a larger scale that people are like, hey, we're seeing a lot of traumatic imagery regarding Black people dying, being brutalized, racism being, racist acts being perpetrated against them. It starts to get too much, especially as Black people, when you're watching this happen to someone that looks like you, it has its own effects as well. And this video too had its own impact, has its own effects. I mean, I can't sit here and say that sharing this content didn't help in some way with this case. That the fact that so many people had witnessed it, had seen it, had this evidence on our phones, were able to watch it and send it to far and wide to as many people as possible, it helped, obviously, in this case. It made it one to watch out for, one to keep track of, one to keep up with. But there are a lot of other cases that slip through the cracks, where though there's the video evidence, not enough people are being held accountable for their actions, so we don't always get a guilty verdict in the end. And that might seem bleak, but it is important to reiterate just how important it was, how much of a role the video itself played in this case, and the fact that a lot of people, Black, white, Asian, whatever, stood up in the streets and stood against injustice, against police brutality, and continue to do so. Continue to call out the officers in question, continue to use their names to say, hey, we see that this is a problem and this is how we're gonna use it to fight. And we're seeing that fight happen across social media with hashtags, people being mobilized for protests over social media. So we can't say that social media, isn't helping. The spread of this content isn't somewhat helping towards the fight for change, the fight for justice. But we also cannot ignore just how much of an impact viewing such traumatic imagery can have on us, on our mental health, on how we view ourselves as well. Now, last summer, a few weeks after protests had already started sparking across the globe, we got a chance to speak with psychotherapist Marcy Gray on how these types of videos, especially when related to racism, can have an impact on our mental health, on how we're feeling, on even our world view. So we're gonna show a quick clip from our archives of this past episode, so take a look.
Racial trauma is race-based trauma, and it can be secondary trauma, so it can be based on you seeing things that are traumatic for other people. So great example is the video of George Floyd. I personally did not watch the video because I found it very difficult to watch all the way through. And so watching some of those things can actually really be traumatic for a lot of people. So you do want to be careful with all the images and all the negativity that you expose yourself to, especially if you know it's going to impact your mood or you're already struggling with mood or anxiety. You just want to be mindful of your exposure to the negativity and the exposure to the news and your exposure to some of the images that are out there of racism or of other people's experience with being killed or police brutality or etc. Just be mindful of how that impacts you and how that has an impact on your view of the world. Your world view can really end up being really quite negative or tainted. So you just want to be mindful of that and to be able to insert some positivity and some positive values is really looking at forward thinking, looking at hope, and looking at what does this mean for this time of this time that we're living in.
Yeah.
So this could really very well mean a revolutionary period of change. It can very well mean that we're watching the society become more aware of racism and of injustice in that many communities have been facing for so many years. And a lot of the times change begins with awareness. So it can be a really optimistic time to be able to consider the fact that society may be at the cusp of change. Racial trauma.
Now, that was psychotherapist Marcy Gray discussing race-based trauma and how traumatic or graphic videos and content like the video of George Floyd's murder can be really impactful on our mental health, how we view the world. And she mentioned a term which was secondary trauma or secondary traumatic stress, which is frequently used to refer to the indirect trauma that can occur when we are exposed to difficult or disturbing images and stories secondhand. So even if you hadn't physically gone through whatever the trauma is, just watching videos alone could have you dealing with secondary traumatic stress. This can occur by viewing graphic news reports, gruesome or frightening television shows, and various other media, or hearing a detailed traumatic story from another person, viewing crime scene evidence, working in a courtroom or attending a briefing or conference where disturbing images are described or shown. And there are many other ways in which we can be indirectly affected by the content or visuals of some other living creature's suffering. And over time, it is reported that repeated exposure to difficult content can have a negative impact on our functioning and overall mental health. And it's important to develop a sense of our individual warning signs and develop tools to mitigate these negative effects. Now, all this is to say that if you, having watched a video of someone being killed or brutalized or, had a racist act perpetrated against them, and it's triggered you to feel some sort of empathy or stress and compassion in the situation, that this is normal and that there's even a term for it, secondary traumatic stress, and that being able to remove yourself from the situation, not having to indulge in this type of content may help you to, deal with it, come to terms with the fact that this may be a reality for some, and it's really hard to watch and witness and experience, and just acknowledging that. It's okay to acknowledge that it triggers you. It's okay to acknowledge that it doesn't make you feel good. It's okay to acknowledge that maybe it's a little too much for you to take in. And that's the thing about social media now, is that before, you would generally see, pictures of starving babies on the news. You'd see war zones on the news, and you'd be able to turn it off. If you didn't want to read that article, you put the newspaper away, or you close the web browser that you're reading it on. But now it's everywhere we go. It's not just in our news cycles anymore. It's on our social media pages. It's shared by our friends and family. And though in instances like this, being able to share what has gone on has led to something hopeful, had led to some kind of justice being served, we can't ignore how much of an impact that has on us as well. That it can feel tiring sometimes, where every day you're waking up and you're trying to get away from, death and destruction, but that's all you're seeing. It might be some time to change that perspective, change that lens. Now we're gonna take a very quick break, and once we're back, we will continue discussing whether we need to continue sharing, creating such traumatic and graphic content for us to understand and be aware of what is going on in the society and the world around us. So stay tuned.
GBKM TV, the station with a vision. GBKM TV, the station with a difference now. Slim Flex said so. Big up Ghana, up. GBKM TV.
Hi, it's Andrea Barrett, and I'm the host of a brand new show, 360 Wellness, right here on the GBKM network. Join us Tuesday, April 27th at 7 p.m. Whether you're a stay-at-home parent, a senior, a student, a working professional, or an entrepreneur, join us for information, tips, and strategies that will keep you well and get you well. Join us live at www.gbkm.tv or download our app, GBKM, on iOS or Android. 360 Wellness. Eat well, live well.
Hello and welcome back to the Chat Up Show. I'm your host, Elizabeth Lloyd, and today we are discussing the concept of sharing traumatic content, and as it refers to justice for George Floyd, as there was a verdict reached yesterday regarding the trial of Derek Chauvin versus the state. And he has been found guilty on all counts, which was great news for a lot of people, but it also brought up the emotions, as I mentioned, of watching George Floyd be murdered in broad daylight, have a knee pressed to his neck for that length of time, was a lot for people to witness. But if that video hadn't surfaced on social media, how would we have known? How would it have sparked the protest that we saw? How would it have sparked the change that we saw? That use of excessive force now has been banned in quite a few precincts across the state. It led to protests across the world where statues that would, celebrate, in a sense, those who participated and led the transatlantic slave trade and colonialism and, had brutalized a lot of people for centuries, were taken down. Instead of being commemorated, they were, people were calling for them to be removed from spaces so that we weren't celebrating the darkness of it all, really. And a lot of sharing this graphic content comes from people wanting to hold the necessary parties accountable. It drives conversation. We know now that social media really is the driver of a lot of our conversation and our culture these days, that we look to social media to get our news a lot of the time. We look to social media to engage with others, to stay connected. It's the space where most of this trial even was shared. It's where a lot of people learned of the verdict. Instead of just watching it on television anymore, they got their news from social media. So we know that this is a place where information can spread like wildfire. And that in itself, if you are triggered by certain content, by graphic content, means that you might have to take it upon yourself to remove yourself from situations where you're constantly viewing it. And with the help of technology now, it's a bit easier. Now we have some controls in place where, if you don't want to see a graphic video or image, there's some controls put in place on Instagram, on Twitter as well. We're starting to recognize as a society that not everyone has to view the graphic content to understand what's going on. Not everyone needs to see that to realize that, racism is real. It hasn't died. It hasn't really gone anywhere. It's just been modernized. Now we see, racist rhetoric being spewed in 140 characters or less. Well, it's more now because Twitter has increased the character limit. But the use of social media to hold folks accountable, we know it works to some degree. It worked for George Floyd's case. It worked in other situations as well, for even Breonna Taylor's case, to get them to, reopen it and recheck out the charges that were filed against the police officers who essentially killed her at the end of the day. It allows for a lot of healing to also take place, where people can say, like, hey, this triggered me, and hey, that triggered me as well, and they can receive support for one another. It helps us to educate each other. We're allowing us to learn about the realities that some people face in real time. And seeing it happen in real time, yes, it can be hard to watch, but there are benefits to it. Holding people accountable is the biggest benefit we can think of, is if we can see their face, see their badge number, identify people from a iPhone video quickly, not even in the case of police brutality as well, even in the quote unquote Karen situation, where there were people calling the cops on Black folks left, right, and center. And the best way to, call attention to this was to videotape what was going on so that people would be able to identify those in the video. And though that, of course, leads to the whole question of should you be videotaping someone without their consent, but that's a whole other discussion right now. What we're focusing on is the use of graphic imagery to, kind of sell the point. I mean, a lot of the time it's used as proof, like, hey, this is what happened. Here's a video to back up what my claims are, right? Especially in such a situation like this, where so many people could have different interpretations, quote unquote, of the event. But now there's video proof that we can all see that's empirical, and objective as well, that we can't deny or fight, that it's there, it's clear as daylight, that Derek Chauvin had his knee on George Floyd's neck for an extended period of time. We heard George Floyd call out for help, saying that he can't breathe. He can't breathe. That rings in a lot of people's head. That's stuck in a lot of people's heads. But then when we start to see this being replicated almost in other forms of media, in our films, in our television, in our literature, it starts to bring up the question of whether it's about awareness or if people know that now this is what a lot of people are talking about. A lot of people are talking about police brutality against black people. A lot of people are talking about police killing black people. If we can make more movies about it, maybe that may help bring more awareness to the situation, or it's just the way the entertainment industry is going now. And that's it's brought up a lot of conversation about when it's necessary to, make movies about this. Like a year after maybe feels a little too soon to start making movies that, resemble or replicate what's gone on, especially for George Floyd and George Floyd's case. A lot of people feel that there's too many movies out there about black trauma. I mean, we have the whole going through slavery, just touching on that. And then there's the civil rights movement, colonialism, all of that. That's so much black trauma already. That's centuries of black trauma that's already out there, already been televised, already had the cinematic debut and experience. And now we're seeing the modernized version of that, where there's so many more stories coming out about police brutality and young black men being killed by police. And people are feeling that it's becoming too much now, that the point of having this type of media out there is being lost in the entertainment factor. That once we start seeing too many movies about it, we might become too desensitized to it, we might dissociate from it, that it won't feel as real as it actually is, that this is something that happens often. This is a reality that a lot of people face, that when they leave in the morning to go to work, they're praying that they don't get stopped by the police in fear of something similar happening. Now, this is a graphic image as well. This was enough to tell the story, to paint a picture, right? But we also have a video too to prove it. And then now we're having movies coming out on Netflix, on Amazon, on, all these different platforms to also raise awareness for what's going on. But to what extent does it then become oversaturation of this kind of content? Like, we're already talking about it in the news. We're already talking about it because there's a trial. We're already talking about who's involved, and now to see that also playing out in our entertainment world, a world where a lot of people would rather escape their reality than have to reface it. But then you also think about, who is this content for? Is it for the people who live it? Or is it to paint the picture for those who don't understand it, who are still having a hard time grasping it? Even after seeing that George Floyd video, there were people who were finding so many different ways to justify the use of excessive force. So many people up until even the verdict who were justifying it, saying that, well, if George Floyd hadn't done this in his past, if he hadn't done this, if he hadn't used that, if he hadn't been here or there, anywhere, finding different ways to justify it, even as we were all watching and witnessing it in this video. So maybe this content is to, speak to them, speak to those who are still, quote unquote, non-believers, that racism is still alive and well, that think that not everything is about race. And in some instances, it may be that we can't completely ignore that, given the history of the world, that race isn't involved in a lot of these situations. So should we continue sharing this graphic content in hopes that hopefully it will continue keeping it at the front of our minds, reminding us that this is still a reality, that because this case did reach a verdict where Derek Chauvin has been found guilty, can we do the same for every other case after this? And there have been a lot of other cases after this. Remember, Jacob Blake, a few months after George Floyd's death, was shot 7 times in the back. Even up until yesterday, where the 16-year-old black girl was shot as well. That this is still happening. And we can still talk about it without showing this graphic content. I mean, the person that took the video of the 16-year-old girl chose not to show her body, chose only to show the officers that were there at the scene and the scene around her. She specifically made the choice not to show the body because it was so graphic and it could be triggering and traumatizing. So there is a way that we can hold the necessary parties accountable if need be, because we cannot completely get rid of sharing such content. I mean, we want change and justice, you're going to need to, back up your claims that this is something that happened, here's a video. But there's a way that we can share this information. There's a way we can disseminate this information without also putting out more triggering, more traumatic imagery that shows what is the reality of the situation, but doesn't, constantly affect our mental health, doesn't constantly affect our self-worth, our self-esteem, how we view ourselves, how we view others as well. We also have to remember the climate that we're in. The time this video came out, tensions were already high. So it's understandable why folks wanted to spread this as far and as wide as possible, because it's like, hey, this is what a lot of people have been crying about for so long. And if you're not going to wake up now, you're probably never going to wake up. But just look at it. Take it in. Acknowledge what is going on in this video. If you don't even want to put in any of the other context outside of just what's within this video, what we see here is a man with his knee on someone's neck. And this has been analyzed. Even through the trial, it was analyzed, obviously treated as evidence, had different, professionals come in and talk about it, had the witnesses, the bystanders come and give their testimonies about it. And everyone agreed that this was an excessive use of force that was not necessary and that ultimately led to his death. No matter how many times people tried to put out their own narrative, their own rhetoric, that this is what was seen in the video, what was seen by the first responders, by the witnesses, what was seen by even those who performed the autopsy on George Floyd after, that these series of events is what led up to his death. It's powerful. It's a powerful image, and it's one that's been burned into a lot of our minds for so long. And it's hard to ignore just how much of an impact it has had on the way we speak about this kind of trauma, race-based trauma especially. How we're starting to understand just how much of an impact it has. People that have never met in real life, people who had never even met or interacted with George Floyd, felt some compassion and empathy for him and his family, were triggered and traumatized by this image so much that it led to, people of all ages marching in the streets across the world. Like that in itself is something to take note of. And maybe this is the time that we're going to really start thinking about what it is that we want out of this change, what it is we want out of justice, what it is we're getting out of videotaping these incidences. There's always the conversation of why people are just standing around and taping it, why don't they intervene? We can't sit here and judge about why people didn't, jump in and try to pull him off George Floyd's neck. We can't sit here and speculate like why they didn't do this, why they didn't do that. They were thinking about their safety as well. But just the fact that we have this video, that was enough. That was enough to wake people up. That was enough to show the truth of the situation. That was enough to have people really thinking. We had a lot of people shook. We had politicians ready to speak up, speak out against anti-Black racism. There were grants put in place to help Black entrepreneurs. We had acts put in place. People were taken to court. Money was donated left, right, and center across the globe. We had protests. Statues were coming down. This was a moment in history. And I think that it's going to stay with us for a very long time, because I can't forget where I was when I heard this verdict. I'm not even going to lie, I couldn't breathe for most of yesterday waiting for it, because I did not want to watch the trial, because I knew that it was just going to trigger me all over again. It was going to make me realize just how many people had lost their lives to police brutality, and how few had gotten to this stage, how few had gotten to this point. And if it weren't for that video, I'm going to keep saying it over and over again, because it's the truth. If it weren't for that video, a lot of people wouldn't have felt mobilized to even speak up. A lot of people probably wouldn't have even cared about this case. But the fact that it was so graphic, it left so many people speechless, that it went on for so long. It had people talking. And yesterday, George Floyd's girlfriend did come out and speak during a press conference, and she said that his death happened for a reason. And though it's sad and it's traumatic and it's heartbreaking that he had to die this way, it has people really thinking about the world around us, thinking about how we can create spaces where we can actually make the necessary changes. And though it's graphic, I think it did what it needed to do. It got people waking up, talking about it, thinking about their own actions, thinking about what have I done to contribute to this system of oppression. Because at the end of the day, it's part of the system of oppression. As I mentioned, this isn't the first time we've seen police brutality on tape, on video. We watched as Philando Castile's girlfriend live streamed his own death while he was in the car and he was shot to death. We watched that. We watched Eric Garner be choked to death too. We watched that. We witnessed that. And now we're thinking of, the future generations, how they're going to be impacted by this. Because we also have to remember, it wasn't just grown-ups and adults who maybe have seen some hard things in life who could adjust to it that were just seeing these images. It's also the teenagers, the kids that are on social media witnessing this too. That's driving this conversation as to how much traumatic and graphic content do we really need to be indulging in, taking in, seeing, to really feel the need to make a change. Maybe for us older generations, we need to see it to believe it. But we have even a younger generation of filmmakers. I mean, Marseille Martin, who became popular off her role on the hit TV show Blackish, owns her own production company, and she says now she's not going to do any movie that, plays into the part of, showing off Black trauma. She doesn't want to be a part of that, that she wants to show another narrative that Black people can be happy, good things can happen, they can be successful. We have stories too that aren't just about us being brutalized by the police, being killed in broad daylight by police, aren't being harassed on the streets by people because they feel that we don't belong somewhere. And it's understandable, because if you're already seeing it in the news and that's your reality, and you hear the stories from people around you because that's their reality too, chances are you're probably not going to want to watch it in a movie again and keep being reminded as to why the world essentially doesn't love you, doesn't value your life. Because even though we are trying to bring awareness, we're trying to educate, we can't forget that that's also another side of it, is that for these young kids coming up, seeing themselves being killed and shot and not protected, feel as though those who are oppressing you are the ones being protected. We remember we had those 3 officers standing, the one standing in the front, the 2 kneeling next to Derek Chauvin when this happened. Seeing that constantly playing out in all forms of media will have an effect on how this next generation is coming up, how they see the world, how they see themselves. And we really cannot forget that. But again, it's like society keeps the same cycle going, is that we almost love seeing this trauma playing out. We're ready to share it as soon as a new video comes up. We're ready to talk about it at work the next day. It's like it's becoming normalized that this is a point of conversation. Like, hey, did you see that video of George Floyd being killed in the street? And a lot of people do worry that we are being desensitized to this, that this is something that we're becoming so used to that even in the way we speak about it, it's like, oh, here's another one that's happened again this week. It's like a mass shooting now. That there have been so many mass shootings in the last few weeks, but not all of them have been reported. Not all of them are being talked about, because it's like, well, this is where we're at. How many can we, make go viral on social media? There's so many that slip through the cracks. It's not every story that goes viral to this extent. And that's unfortunate. And it's sad, but we also know that if we keep talking about it, it'll bring more awareness, hopefully lead to positive change. And that's the entire thing at the end of the day, is that a lot of people are wanting to see positive change. And if that means sharing this graphic content, if that means, telling that story or making that movie that shows a Black man being killed over and over and over again. And that is a new movie available right now on a certain streaming platform that you can go watch today, where he keeps waking up, and every single time he wakes up, it's the same day, and he's getting killed by the same cop, no matter what he does, over and over and over again. That can most definitely have an effect on someone. Not just the actor as well, but people viewing it. People viewing it as entertainment, but it's really a reality. And it's about representation, right? And the rhetoric that's put out there. It's like how a lot of people had an issue when the only news coverage about Africa were pictures of starving children, that everyone was starving and were all incredibly skinny and had flies in their face. The people were like, "This, you can't just only show this." Yes, it may be a reality. Yes, it may be happening, but it's not the only imagery that you can put out there because it's not necessarily 100% the truth. Let's talk about why we have so many of these children who you're able to photograph and use in your news cycles for years and years to come, to use in the charity PSAs for years and years to come. Why is it still there? Why do you still need these PSAs if you have continuously asked for donations and their whole organizations put in place to ensure that this doesn't continue happening? It's the same thing with police brutality videos too. Like, why do I have to keep seeing this? And you keep calling us for action, but there's nothing really changing. You have all these politicians coming up and doing press conferences. Like, we completely do not accept the acts that were shown. They do not represent us. Yada, yada. It's the same speech over and over again. This isn't new. Graphic content is not new. It's just that now it's everywhere. It's almost invasive that you can't really get away from it. Because if you didn't want to see those images, you could have just turned your TV off back in the day and changed the channel, turned it to something new. But now it's everywhere we go. It's, as I said, it's in our news, it's in our newspapers, it's online, it's in our pockets, it's in our hands, it's everywhere we go. But maybe that is the change that we need. Maybe that's what we really need to really start thinking about, how we as a society continue to indulge in this trauma and graphic content, and if that has actually helped us progress and move forward. So I'm going to leave you guys with that and just say again how this verdict was a step in the right direction for hope for a lot of people, that a lot of people feel seen and heard and validated, and that there was some justice found. But there's also those who feel that this isn't enough. Okay, one person received a guilty verdict. What about all the others? Will there be actual institutional change that comes from this? And only time will tell. As we said before, when we first reported on this murder case, when it first happened, we said we can hope for this to make it to court, make it to trial, and it doesn't just get swept under the rug, like a lot of the others do. And it did. And we can hope that, the verdict comes out and it provides some sort of justice for George Floyd's family and his loved ones. And it did to some extent, to some degree. Hopefully this is a step in the right direction, but also we think about just what kind of content we're sharing and why we're sharing it. Because at the end of the day, it's the why. Why do we want to watch this video over and over again? Is it to be reminded? Is it to educate? Is it to raise awareness? Is it all of the above? And that concludes our show for today. Thank you so much for chatting it up with me. As always, you can keep up with the GBCam network in various ways. You can listen and watch live 24/7 at www.gbkm.fm or www.gbkm.tv. You can also download our free app where you'll be notified every time we go live, so you'll never have to miss another show again. That's available on the App Store and the Google Play Store. And you can continue to watch us on Facebook at GBCam Television and YouTube at GBCam TV. Follow us on Instagram at GBCam FM and Twitter at GBCam_FM. You can follow me, your host, for more updates on the show at TIS_Liz_O on Instagram and Twitter. And with that, I will chat with you the same time, same place next week. Chat you later. Take care.
GBKM TV, the station with a vision. GBKM TV, the station with a difference now.
The bad news is that everyone is a potential victim, but the good news is that everyone is a potential solution. Sensitize the masses to sanitize, keep a social distance and quarantine.
Coronavirus is sweeping over mankind.
Everybody must be alert. It's a global pandemic we can never take for granted. Kila mtu must be alert. It's a matter of life we can never take for granted. This discipline and personal hygiene, and make sure you regularly wash your hands. Keep a distance from everyone. Report anything like a symptom. Serious fever is a symptom. Dry cough is a symptom. Walkway tamula is a symptom. Itchy eyes and flu is a symptom.
Wikumo butabusiga twejemu batannalwala olaga omwoyo gw'eggwanga olabira ku itale abasinga bafudde okubwewala kisingako obujjanjaba. The coronavirus is sweeping over mankind.
Everybody must be alert. It's a global pandemic. We can.
Hi, it's Andrea Barrett, and I'm the host of a brand new show, 360 Wellness, right here on the GBKM network. Join us Tuesday, April 27th at 7 p.m. Whether you're a stay-at-home parent, a senior, a student, a working professional, or an entrepreneur, join us for information, tips, and strategies that will keep you well and get you well. Join us live at www.gbkm.tv or download our app, GBKM, on iOS or Android. 360 Wellness.